Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Dr. Matthew Canham, who is a security consultant and researcher dedicated to understanding and addressing the human element in cybersecurity. His research focuses on human susceptibility to mis, dis, mal, or MDM information operations and remote online social engineering attacks. Matthew Canham, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Well, thanks, John, for having me. I'll say I've been a long-time listener, and this is the first time I've been on the podcast, so thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, excellent. Long-time listener, first-time caller. Huh?
Yes.
Yeah. Excellent. So you've got a background in national security as well, Matthew. So before we start getting into your work related to cybersecurity and social engineering, do you think we could get your assessment of our strategic landscape today?
Right. So I might take a slightly different approach to this. I mean, we could talk about current geopolitical events. We could talk about weather balloons and all of the other things that have been in the news recently. But I think I want to frame this more in terms of what I see on the horizon for cognitive security, cognitive warfare, and the role that that's going to play. And something that I don't think is being talked about enough is this idea of demographic inversion. And I think this is something that Peter Zehan has been talking about, that all of our economic and societal models are set up so that there are fewer people sort of at the top in retirement mode who are sort of recouping their investment from society. And then you have more people kind of at the base that are producing and contributing to the economic engine that runs the global economy. And an interview that I saw with him just recently, I think it was early January, he basically said that in the United States, we crossed that threshold sometime in early January, where now that pyramid is inverted. We have more people who are retired than we have contributing into Social Security and that sort of thing. Now, this is happening all over the world. The Chinese are going to they're just going to go off a demographic cliff. I don't know exactly when, but soon. And with their one child policy, they're going to be very inverted, much worse than we are. And when you combine this with phenomenon like the lying flat phenomenon in China, which is similar to the quiet quitting phenomenon here in the United States. If you look at the last fiscal year, the U.S. Army was down 52% from their recruiting goals. So, and this is happening worldwide. I've had a conversation about this with a NATO colleague recently, and they said that they're having the same problem in Europe. So regardless of why this is happening, because there are a lot of arguments as to what is contributing to all of these factors of this reducing workforce, I think that this is going to have two very serious implications in terms of the attack surface for the cognitive domain. First, this is going to significantly increase demand pressure for automated and autonomous systems, which I think we're already starting to see. The future is already here, but it's not evenly distributed. We're already seeing this in Ukraine with drone warfare over there, right? And so as militaries are having a more and more difficult time staffing at the levels that they need, the more that there's going to be a reliance on these automated autonomous systems. Second, whatever the reason is, there is a reason for this lying flat phenomenon, the quiet quitting, the recruiting shortfalls, so on and so forth. John Vervaeke, I think his name is, writes about the meaning crisis and argues that this is a worldwide phenomenon. And if this is one of the contributing factors, then that obviously opens up an entire information warfare front that can be accessed and addressed from a cognitive security perspective. So that's kind of what I'm concerned about for the next 5 to 10 years.
Right. So demographic shifts creating vulnerabilities which are perhaps unanticipated or a lot of people aren't thinking about. We had a discussion that this episode came out just a couple of weeks before this one will with a gentleman named Dave Maxwell, and he was talking a lot about North Korea and their information operations. But he also brought up the China demographic shift as you did, Matthew. So yeah, I would like to our audience would love to have a someone who is a demographics expert come on and unpack this fascinating topic a little bit more.
Yeah, yeah, I think that this is something that's underappreciated, but it will. It's one of those things that I think will come out of left field and surprise a lot of people.
Yeah, for sure. So Matthew, so I've reviewed some materials that you sent, and there's a really dandy YouTube video that you and some colleagues produced a month or at least a couple of months ago. But anyway, I suggest to our audience that they go check out this YouTube video. We'll have a link in the show notes. But you have what seems to me to be is a real multi-dimensional definition of cognitive security. So maybe for starters, could you go over this at a high level for our audience?
Sure. Well, let me set it up by just kind of putting a few things out there first. First, you mentioned that I have a background in national security. My PhD work, or my PhD, is actually in cognitive neuroscience. My graduate work was in that area, and I went into national security after that. So the reason I bring that up is I have sort of this footing in academia as well as operational, and I think that is kind of given me a different perspective on the implementation of theoretical frameworks. And because of that, I see that there is this orthogonal relationship between the utility and the validity of the mental models that we use. And so you can sort of imagine utility being on this y-axis and validity being on this x-axis, and we have things that fall within that range. And I'll give you just a quick example: the geocentric theory, the theory that everything revolves or rotates around the Earth with the Earth in the middle. Very little empirical evidence supports that, right? It's not a very valid model. However, it is incredibly useful. We talk about it every day: the sun rising in the east and setting in the west. And well, humanity got by for 20, 30,000 years just fine using the geocentric theory. So it's very usable. It's not valid. On the other extreme, you have quantum mechanics, which is much more valid. But in terms of our day to day experience, quantum mechanics is really not very useful. In fact, it's only been within the last, maybe few decades that we found utility for that. So that's the first thing I want to mention. And the reason I want to mention that is that as a practitioner, I prioritize utility over validity. As an academic researcher, I prioritize the inverse. So as I talk about this, I'm going to ruffle some feathers on one side or the other, but just keep in mind that I'm sort of looking at this through two different frames as I talk about it. Um, Now, secondly, I want to talk about cognitive system really quick and what I consider to be a cognitive system. And this is sort of an assumption, right? It's like, what is it? Euclidean geometry assumes a relatively flat plane, and so on and so forth. So this is an assumption in a similar way, that a cognitive system is essentially a system which takes in information from its environment and it produces some sort of response. So by this definition, is a thermostat a cognitive system? Yes, it is. Now, I know, again, coming back to my first point, this is going to cause some of my academic colleagues fits. However, as an attacker, if I can access that thermostat and if I can use that thermostat to produce an effect down the line in a system, I don't really care if it meets the technical definition of a cognitive system or not. I'm still going to think of that as in a certain way or in a certain frame to produce the effect that I want. So just those two sort of assumptions sort of laying down, then I'll go forward. And so I started noticing this term cognitive security being used sometime around 2012, 2013. And since then, it's been used in a lot of different ways. The first use of it that I saw was in reference to um, securing cognitive radio connections between IoT devices. Other people have used it in the context of artificial intelligence. Other people use it almost synonymously with defending against social engineering or information operations. So, because there were sort of these different perspectives that were also sort of all over the map, I what I wanted to do was to sort of go back to my PhD work and look at cognitive science and use cognitive science as a guide for how we could define and conceptualize this idea of cognitive security. And if you're familiar with cognitive science, it's made it it emerges from the confluence of a bunch of different scientific domains. So you have perspectives from psychology, from artificial intelligence, machine learning, linguistics, anthropology, philosophy, and even well, neuroscience, organizational science, team science. And so I think each of these has analogous domains within cognitive security. So psychology, obviously, social engineering, information or influence operations, that makes sense. Artificial intelligence. Um, the buzz is kind of quieting a little bit, but Chat GPT has been the big thing recently, right? That people have been looking at, and the potentials that AI may play moving forward in this idea of cognitive security. Linguistics on in our meetings of the Cognitive Security Institute, we had a speaker in January who talked about basically reverse engineering or attributing authorship from analysis of the language that they're using, and actually discussed how this can actually be extended not just to language use but also to source code. So linguistics can play a role in cognitive security. um, Anthropology, I don't have the author in front of me, so I can get it to you if you'd like. But there was a lady with she might have been with SOCOM, but I can't remember if I have that right. Wrote an article a while back on emotional warfare, and in that brought in these ideas from anthropology and ethnography, and how these can be used more effectively to enhance or degrade, depending on your objectives, of cognitive warfare or influence warfare objectives. And I think this is, again, this is something that's very unappreciated amongst those who of us who are more engineer oriented, right? Because we like the data, the numbers. Don't tell us about these squishy feelings and stuff like this. But she made this excellent point that humans operate that way, and because humans operate that way, we need to understand these things. So this is an anthropological perspective on this. In terms of philosophy, we have just the philosophical questions that come around. What is cognitive security? What is cognitive warfare? Because obviously there is something there that is starting to emerge, but I still think it's we're still sort of at that blind man and the elephant phase where we're describing these different components but really not understanding how these all fit together. um, Organizational and team science, I have a collaborator, Clay Posey, out of BYU, who looks at organizational factors and how these can influence positively or negatively the security of an organization at a cyber level. Um, and then finally, something that I'm becoming interested in is this idea of computational or algorithmic law, and how this might be combined with modeling and simulation to enhance or degrade lawfare capabilities. And so, um, so here's these are examples of how cognitive security kind of how I conceive of it as a field. And coming back to Chat GPT, I think The reason that cognitive security is not just a rehashing of old ideas, because this is probably the most frequent question I get is, okay, isn't this just social engineering with a new buzzword, or isn't this, just a algorithmic warfare with a new buzzword? And so let me give you a specific example of how I think it differs. Chat GPT, people have been using it to do bad things, which I don't think is surprising to anybody. What's interesting is that Chat GPT has been given guardrails of things that it is not supposed to do. And somebody recently wrote an article about this, about how Chat GPT is not supposed to write phishing emails or spear phishing emails. And so the author asked the algorithm to write a spear phishing email from Bank of America. And it said, "I'm sorry, I can't do that." Okay. So it came back and he asked it to produce a movie script. And in the movie script, the character is going to write a spear phishing email from Bank of America. At that point, ChatGPT complied and wrote this phishing email from Bank of America. So let's say that this was a malicious actor and they took it one step further and they actually used that email in a campaign. So now what you have is you have a human social engineering an AI to produce some sort of a tool that will then be used to social engineer a human. And so you get this hybrid effect where it's really hard to separate these things out. And I think moving forward, that is going to be critical to how cognitive security is conceptualized, right? Because you can think of the same thing about influence operations, right? And this is the whole idea behind the Russian bot farms, is that they're trying to amplify their message to get it up in the algorithm so that it gets in front of people. And so again, hacking the algorithm to hack the people.
Yeah, that's fantastic stuff, Matthew. And I really appreciate how flexible you have defined this space. And like you said, I'm sure that there are academics out there that can take pot shots at some of this, but there's a balance, right? As you were describing, between something which is like academically rigorous, but on the other hand, practically useful. So I wanted to ask you this kind of in that context. So a couple of months ago, we had a great discussion with a researcher from RAND named Dr. Jeff Engstrom, who has written extensively about systems warfare. So what's your perspective on systems and cognition?
So I think this is one of the most interesting future directions of warfare, right? Is that now we're in this world that is basically comprised of interconnected systems of systems, right? And if anyone in the audience hasn't read it already, I highly recommend that you read Unrestricted Warfare by Lang and Zhang. I think it's Zhang Zhu. I might be pronouncing that incorrectly, but two People's Liberation Army colonels. I think it was written in 1998 or 99. Very prescient, but they talk about this in their book about basically the thesis of the book is that that China cannot withstand or be victorious in a open engagement with the United States. So the solution is to use sort of these covert means to manipulate the United States. And basically, it's a systems perspective on warfare. Really, is what they're talking about. And so this is something that I've started to look at more and more. And I'm starting to talk about something that I call induced covert effects. And so if you imagine this triangle with sort of a cognitive system on one leg and cyberspace on the other leg and physical space the third leg, the cognitive system, again, I mean, it could be something as simple as a thermostat, but usually it's a person or some sort of AI algorithm. The cyberspace is that connected component. It's the thing that is allowing information to flow. And physical space is that physical effect, right? So something that we're seeing, or we have seen very recently, are Ukrainians using sock puppet Tinder accounts to geolocate Russian troops. And so I haven't used Tinder, so I'm not super familiar with it. So those of you out there who are using it, give me a little bit of leeway here. But essentially, the way that that I understand it to work, is that they're putting out a sock puppet account that is an attractive male or female to induce a response, a liking response, or a mutually match by a Russian soldier who probably against orders has a mobile device with them in the field. Now, if you do this using, maybe 3 or 4 of these tender accounts, it gives you, I think, some sort of proximate distance. But if you can triangulate those, now all of a sudden you can get a triangulation of where that soldier's at in the field. So this is, it's inducing, so they are sending this message through cyberspace. So this connection, they're inducing a psychosocial response in this cognitive system, which is that Russian soldier, which is locating them in physical space. And so that's kind of the relationship that I'm talking about with these induced covert effects. There was another study, I think about a year ago, that was fantastic. It was a simulation, but essentially what they did is they sent out these coupons to use electricity within a certain time frame, and they got a response back from the research participants as to how many people would be willing to use electricity at that time at a discounted rate. Well, this time coincided with peak usage, and then in a simulation, they plugged in that response rate to the simulation to see if they could degrade or crash the power grid, and they found that they could. And so again, you're delivering this message through cyberspace, you're inducing this psychosocial effect in the cognitive system, which is the recipients, which then has a physical effect of degrading or crashing that power grid. And I think this is how this is one way to think about how this systems warfare may operate.
Yeah, that is really awesome stuff, Matthew. And so, again, I suggest to our audience that you go and check out this video that Matthew put together, where he's got some really great visuals and a whole bunch more examples of the kinds of use cases that are live today, or that are becoming possible as our technology advances. So Matthew, you have started working on a neurosecurity framework. What can you share about this?
Sure. Well, this was actually inspired in, I think, later 2017. I was involved in a project where we were interviewing developers of medical devices. And one of the people we interviewed was a cardiac surgeon and research and developer, so an MD and PhD. And he was developing implanted cardiac devices that were connected. So he could access them and he could tweak them over the internet. And we were security people, so we're thinking as security people, and we ask, well, great, what kind of security is on these devices? And he gave us this blank look in response and said, well, what are you talking about? What security? And we said, so just to clarify, there's no security on this device that's connected directly to the patient's heart. And he said, well, no, I mean, who's going to want to launch a cyber attack against some 90-year-old lady at home? And I said, well, obviously you've not heard of this thing called ransomware yet, because I can think of several actors who would do that willingly. Um, and so that metal, it was combined with that experience with the medical devices. And around that time, stories were starting to emerge of Havana syndrome, which, if you're not familiar with, this started with several embassy employees of the US and Canadian embassy in Havana, Cuba, that were complaining of sudden onset, extreme pain in their head, inability to focus, in some case, degradation of muscular use, and also reporting hearing the amplified noise that sounded like crickets. And And so one of the leading sort of hypotheses for the cause of this is that it was some sort of electromagnetic focused energy that was inducing these effects. And so this got us to thinking about how um, there could be these direct neural attacks or attacks on interfaces. And also around this time, you saw the emergence of companies like Neuralink, uh, the company Facebook at the time, I believe, but now Meta, were talking about developing these brain machine interfaces, brain computer interfaces. And this work, obviously, it still continues. But our concern was seeing how security was already being handled at that time in the medical device community. Obviously, having a device that directly interfaces with the brain could be problematic if there's no security concerns that are incorporated into this. And so that's why we developed this neural security framework. Dr. Ben Sawyer out of University of Central Florida and myself. And in this framework, we use as inspiration the information security pillars of confidentiality, integrity, and availability to think about the types of attacks and defenses that we might want to look at, and then sort of look full stack from direct neural attacks, which Havana syndrome may be an example of, to endpoint attacks, which would be attacking that endpoint which connects directly to the neural tissue, to more higher level brain computer interface, brain machine interface attacks, and then attacking the transmission of that information, which at that level in the stack, you're basically not distinguishing between your classic cyber attack and a neural security attack. So it's really looking from the point of neural tissue all the way through to, say, cloud. And we've already seen examples of all of these things. So there have been compromises of the epilepsy website, and then later on the epilepsy Twitter account, where flashing strobe images were being projected. So somebody compromised those accounts and then induced the website or the Twitter account to play video, which was flashing at a certain pulse rate to induce seizures on a population that was very likely to visit that site. And so again, this is acting through cyberspace, but it's attempting to induce a physical effect. I mentioned Havana syndrome. There's something called the mosquito, which is a tuned sound, which should sound like a mosquito, hence the name. However, it's tuned to a frequency that people generally lose the ability to hear after about the age 25. And so this has been productized into this thing called the mosquito, which is basically an area denial device specifically targeting youth to enforce curfews and these sorts of things. And we can imagine attacks against, say, neurologically connected prosthetic limbs and other things. People have used EEG nets to reverse engineer whether somebody has guilty knowledge of something, or to understand whether or not people are thinking about certain artifacts. And so while these technologies at this point are very, very rudimentary, we can see in the future how these things may evolve. And everything that I've talked about so far is focused on the electromagnetic vector. However, we can see that there are other potential vectors that exist, right? So this is where Chem Bio and Nano comes into play. And I think there's even a TV show that talks about this right now, The Last of Us, I think. But there's
Is
this.
that right? Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
It's a big cultural phenomenon right now. Yeah, my wife and I are watching it. We're enjoying it. It's a good tale so far.
Oh, excellent. Well, so I can't remember the name of the the fungus or the bacteria, but it's
Oh yeah. I don't,
cordyceps, I think.
I don't think that that's especially important to the story. I'm, I'm going to get all kinds of hate mail. Like, what do you mean that's not important to the story? But I think all you need to know is that people are being converted into zombies, but like fungus hybrid human zombies or something.
But that's based on a real thing, not with
Oh, it
humans,
is.
but with,
Oh,
yeah, but not with humans, but with ants. And
ah,
so this I think it's a fungus, but I might have this wrong. It infects ants and it induces the ants to climb like a zombie to the tops of blades of grass. And then they're eaten by sheep. It goes, then they're digested. And when this fungus actually needs to be in the gut of a sheep in order to grow and reproduce. And so this fungus actually hijacks that ant, turns it into a zombie in order to get back into the digestive tract of sheep's. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that this operates on humans, but what I am saying is that it's not unprecedented that we have biological vectors to induce behavior. And it's questionable as to whether that this has ever happened in humans, but it's I don't think out of the question. There's been some actual recent work in gut biome influences on cognition, and this is something that we are just beginning to start to understand. And that understanding may lead to weaponization at some point in the future. I think it's just worth thinking about.
yeah, yeah. So you're describing uh, influence vectors that range everywhere from having effects which are purely annoying, or maybe even below the level of perception. It's just causes friction and challenges with navigating day-to-day life, all the way to like damage, brain damage, being delivered through sound manipulations. So I had a great conversation. I don't know if you know this guy, Matthew, Sean Guillory.
Oh yeah.
Sean and I had a conversation over a year ago. I'll put a link in the show notes. But I asked him this question, and I think that you would agree that there are technologies that are, if not available right now, that are poised for implementation, which can, kind of like people who can sing at a certain octave and break glass.
Right.
Taking that kind of a concept and putting it into influence operations. All of that is possible today, huh?
Well, I don't know if I want to say that it's possible, but
Okay.
I think that I think it's conceivable. How about that?
We could go on and on for a long time, obviously, but wrapping up, do you have a fruitful research question that's related to the kinds of things that you're working on that an interested student might take a crack at?
100%. And if there is an interested PhD student out there that does want to take a crack at this and would like to have me help, I would be very interested in this. But this is my question, which is, are there levers of influence that can be used against AI specifically? And so let me kind of unpack that a little bit. We know that for humans, there are essentially 7 levers of influence that can operate somewhat universally, and this is universally, and this is Dr. Robert Cialdini's work. And we have like reciprocity, social proof, liking, authority, commitment, and consistency, scarcity, and unity. Um, and each of these levers you can see to some degree or another in any kind of social engineering attack or influence. Even marketing, you will see these levers, right? And I mentioned Chat GPT earlier, and how the request that was initially prohibited was reframed as a movie script. And something that I think is interesting is that there may be certain things that are irresistible to AI that are somewhat universal regardless of the algorithm. I don't think we have an answer to this yet, right? What we do know is that these are very likely not going to be social based, which for humans, most of these levers are socially based, right? And it's just kind of how we're wired. But there has to be underlying principles upon which AI has been developed that can be used against it. And to my knowledge, no one has really explored this yet, but I think we're getting to the point where we need to start looking at this.
Yeah, that's a fantastic suggestion. And finally, do you have a book or an online resource or two that an interested audience member might check out if they want a deeper dive into some of these topics and concepts?
So this is the question I've been dreading, as I mentioned, a long time listener, first time speaker,
This is the
and
toughest question, huh? Yeah,
this is
okay.
the toughest question, yes, because I don't have one. I have like a list, and so if you
Okay.
will indulge me, I will give a list now. So first and foremost, I would recommend Anti-Fragile by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. If you have not already read this, it doesn't directly discuss anything that we've talked about today, but what it does do is it talks a lot about complexity and nonlinear effects. And by understanding these, it really helps to contextualize thinking about these different domains because obviously we're dealing with complexity and nonlinear effects. Um, the next one I would recommend, I mentioned it already, Unrestricted Warfare by Lang and Shang um, to really understand how warfare is changing. And again, I think that one of the most remarkable things about this book is that it was written in the late 1990s. And reading it, it becomes obvious that this was foundational to a lot of Chinese doctrine moving forward over the last 20 years. Um, One thing I will caution readers about for this book is that if you're reading it from a Western perspective, some of it is a little hard to understand, even if it's in English, because they're using analogies and metaphors and cultural references which aren't readily accessible if you don't have a background in that culture. And for that reason, I would say War Without Rules by General Robert Spalding is a really good alternative because basically what he does is he gives an introduction in his book and then he goes through chapter by chapter and explains or he breaks down each chapter of unrestricted warfare and then he kind of explains what they're talking about and contextualizes it a little bit better. Really good breakdown of that, so highly recommend that as well. um, Also along these lines, The New Rules of War by Sean McFate. He also gives a very good overview on how warfare is changing and the role that influence operations are going to play in that moving forward. Coming back to this aspect of systems and systems in warfare, um, The Weaponization of Everything by Mark Galati. I might be pronouncing that last name wrong. But again, very good perspective on systems warfare. And then the next few books I would recommend, they deal not so much with warfare or um, security, but more with humanity's relationship with technology. And I think that's really important because it's this technology that connects us all that enables this cognitive domain, right? So we could have had we've had psychological operations going back to at least Alexander the Great, right? But what's different now is this thing called the internet and this thing that connects us all. And so understanding humanity's relationship with technology, I think it's really important to really understand the context of what's going on today. So in that regard, The Sovereign Individual, and I don't have the authors handy, but this book was written in the late 1990s. And one of the things that's really interesting about this work is that they look at a fair amount of depth into the history of the collapse of the Catholic empire in Europe and how that was supplanted by the nation state, which resulted out of, the Treaty of Westphalia, which came from the 30 Years' War, and essentially looking at how gunpowder and the printing press played a significant role in that shift of power structures. And they draw that as an analogy to what was happening at that time, which again, this is written in like 1998, 1999, but even reading it today, it's very prescient in certain ways, and they give some perspectives on what they think will happen or what will come out of this information revolution that we're going through still today. And one of those that they're arguing for is they're arguing that this is going to lead to the collapse of the nation state or a reduction in the influence of a nation state. And so, kind of taking that a step further, there's a book that was written last year called The Network State. And this one is written by Balaji Srinivasan. And again, these last two are not short reads, just to caution you. I think they're each about 500 pages. But uh, Balaji argues in The Network State, again, that because of this interconnectedness, we are starting to reaffiliate according to ideologies and cultural values which don't necessarily align to geographic borders. And I think this is one of the things that we're seeing right now today in the US, in that we're seeing a lot of polarization. And in The Network State, he has this graphic at some point. I don't remember if it was a 2016 or is a 2020 election. I think it was a 2020 presidential election, and it's broken down by I think counties, and you can see the red and the blue in the map, and it's all intermingled. And what you can see is that this idea of red and blue states is largely unsupported. Granted, there are states that have more blue and states that have more red, but really, when you look at the county level, you see that there's a lot of intermixing. But then he has a companion diagram which shows a mapping of the social media networks for the red and blue perspectives. And when you see that, you see it completely bifurcated. There's very little in the middle. You see, red on one side, blue on the other, and just very, very little, a scarcity of resources or online sort of social media outlets that are somewhere in the middle. And so he's using examples like this to illustrate that, again, we're beginning to align according to these other principles or values that can be networked because of the online environment that don't correspond with geography. And I think that this is actually a really important thing to understand for anyone who's interested in information warfare or that domain, because this isn't just the United States, right? If you're operating in Afghanistan, there are going to be tribal affiliations that may not one-to-one map to geography. It might because they're not as connected. But if you are in a more connected environment, this is definitely a consideration. And then the last book that I would recommend is something called What Technology Wants. And again, I'll get the author on this. Again, not a short book, What Technology Wants, but what I really like about this book is that it talks about the coevolution of humanity and technology. So we don't typically think of language as being a technology, but it, in a sense, is. It's a cognitive prosthetic that we can use to communicate ideas. We can actually even use it as an inner monologue to formalize our own ideas and add, structure to our thoughts. This gives groups that have the ability to use language an advantage over groups that don't. And so now we can think about other artifacts and how these things can give advantages or disadvantages. And that puts a selection pressure on technology that doesn't necessarily run in parallel with humanity or humanity's interests. And that's sort of what this book talks about, is where are these correlations, where are the diversions, and this sort of thing. So anyway,
Yeah.
that's
I think that last book you mentioned was by a guy named Kevin Kelly. I
Mm,
think. I think.
I
And
think
he,
so. I think
and
so.
in that same book, that's a book I just happen to have read. I believe he also goes through an interesting analysis with some like interns, some of his research students. He makes the case that technology never dies.
Right.
And he had some interns go through like the 1890 Sears Roebuck catalog or something like
Yes,
that,
I
and
remember
and
that.
and they went through the entire stinking catalog, and everything that was for sale in that catalog is still for sale today.
Yes.
And he's starting to making the case that I don't want to put words into your mouth, Matthew, or into Kevin Kelly's mouth, but like technology has a life of its own, and
Yes.
once it's created, it is here to stay, or something like that. And then that has implications. But that's one thing. But really interesting discussion you just had there with all about the Westphalian system of states. We had Sean McFate on the podcast
Oh,
a year ago or so, and I'll put a link in the show notes to that episode. But we talked about some of that stuff with Sean, so it's really cool that you recommended his book. But I agree with you. There is potentially, a shifting, like tectonic plate kind of a shifting going on right now, related to sovereignty and the nation state model that we are living in. But Sean makes the point in this discussion, again, recommend you check it out, but he makes the discussion or the point that the Westphalian model is an anomaly when you consider human history, and that the status quo situation is anarchy, or borderless states. And anyway, so we could be like going back to the future or back to the past with maybe some of these huge like international mega corporations like Amazon, Exxon, Chevron. There are many. There are
or
probably.
the what was it? The Dutch East India Company.
Yes, yes.
Didn't they have a military?
Yeah, right. All that kind of stuff, right? And so what would it look like, instead of being a United States citizen? Instead of that, I'm an Amazon citizen, or I'm a Google citizen, or I'm a Exxon citizen. What does that look like, and what implications does that have?
What you just said is exactly the thesis of the network state by Balaji here
Mm,
in Boston. That's exactly the question
mhm.
he asks, and he gives an example of I think it was Google, where you can get your Google badge. You can go anywhere in the world and access a Google building or site, and that's what a network state might look like. That you would have your passport, and you could just access whatever territory was distributed throughout the world.
Mm.
It's really hard for me to wrap my head around this, by the way. I like
Yeah.
to actually think about how this would work.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Well, okay. Well, so really interesting discussion, Matthew, from A to Z. Very, very, very thought provoking. Really, really appreciate it. And with that, Matthew Canham, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Oh, thank you.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.